Give me the book, Mom. The voice that spoke was Michael's, but the sound was alien. A harsh, flat tone. That didn't belong in the soft, quiet of my bedroom. There was no greeting, no question of my well-being, just the cold, immediate betrayal of a command. He stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the light from the hall, turning him into a menacing silhouette. My son, the boy whose first word was a garbled version of my name, was now a stranger, demanding I surrender my husband's last secrets. The betrayal was so sharp, so instant, it was like a physical shock, a jolt of ice water through my veins. My fingers tightened on the worn leather of the ledger, my knuckles turning white. The only sound in the room for a long moment was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart against my ribs. Sarah, a serpent at his shoulder, whispered something in his ear, a sibilant hiss I couldn't quite make out, but I felt its venomous intent. Michael took a step into the room. Don't be difficult, he said. And the sound of it, that tired, patronizing sigh, cracked something deep inside me. It was the voice of a man speaking to a disobedient pet, not his mother. This is private, I managed to say, my own voice a dry rustle of leaves, barely audible. This belonged to your father. And now it belongs to the family. Sarah's voice cut in sharp and clear from behind Michael. And we are the family now, Clara, the ones with the future. We need to liquidate old assets. Liquidate old assets. The phrase was so corporate, so devoid of humanity. Was that what I was? An old asset to be liquidated? My gaze remained fixed on Michael, pleading with him silently to see what he was becoming, to hear the monstrous words coming out of his wife's mouth. But his eyes were hard, focused only on the book in my lap. Sarah's right, he said, his voice gaining a cold confidence. Dad was a sentimental old fool, letting people like her father walk all over him. He was weak. Were not. The insult to Arthur, so casual, so dismissive, was a fresh wave of agony. What is the cruelest thing someone you love has ever said to you? How do you even begin to recover when the words are designed not just to hurt, but to erase everything you held sacred? That was what this felt like, an eraser. He was trying to rewrite our entire history into a story of his father's weakness and his own entitlement. I slowly, deliberately closed the ledger. The heavy thump of the cover slamming shut was a definitive sound. It was the sound of a door closing forever. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it rang with a finality that startled even me. The sound of that single word hung in the air, a wall he could not pass. Michael's face contorted, the mask of calm dropping to reveal a flash of raw, ugly fury. He took another step forward, his hand half raised, and for a terrifying second, I thought he might try to take it from me. $50,000, Mom, he repeated, his voice now a low, menacing growl. That was the deal. The text message still stands. You pay or you're out. And now he gestured towards the ledger. That book is part of the payment collateral. I stared at him, at the son I no longer recognized, and felt a profound chilling sorrow. He wasn't just lost. He was gone. The boy I raised would have defended his father's memory with his last breath. This man was willing to sell it for a down payment. The final betrayal when it came was not loud. It was delivered in a quiet, dead voice, stripped of all emotion, which made it all the more devastating. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze as cold and empty as a winter sky. "You know," he said, the sound barely a whisper, "I used to think of you as my mother, but looking at you now, clutching that book, Sarah was right all along. You're not a person. You're just a bank, and you're closed for business." He held my gaze for one last brutal moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Sarah gave me a triumphant, venomous smirk before following him. I sat there, utterly still, the ledger heavy in my lap. The only sound left was the echo of his words, slicing through the silence, severing the final thread that bound us together. A bank. That's all I was. In that deafening quiet, a new feeling began to bloom in the wreckage of my heart. Not grief, but a cold, hard, calculating rage. I remember the weight of his small hand in mine, warm and trusting, as I helped him drop his very first coin into a bright red pig-shaped bank. He must have been 4 years old. "You saved it for something important, my love," I had told him. The sound of the coin rattling inside a happy little promise. I thought I was teaching him the value of patience, of working towards a dream. But sitting alone in my kitchen in the dead of night, the memory felt like a ghost, its warmth replaced by a chilling dread. The lesson he had learned wasn't to save for his own dreams, but to wait for the day he could shatter mine. My son had not just broken his piggy bank. He had taken a hammer to my entire life, and now he was demanding I hand him the pieces. The rage from earlier had cooled into something far more dangerous, a quiet, unshakable resolve. Have you ever been pushed so far that you discovered a strength or a ruthlessness you never knew you had? That's what I felt blossoming in the hollow space where my heart used to be. My hands, which had trembled with grief just hours before, were now perfectly steady. I ran my fingers over the rough leather of Arthur's ledger, a source of power, a map. Then I picked up my phone. The screen felt cold and smooth beneath my thumb, an unforgiving slab of glass. I started with the easy things, the digital threads that still connected us. On the banking app, I found the supplementary credit card I'd given him years ago for emergencies only. His last emergency had been a weekend trip to a luxury resort with Sarah. My thumb hovered over the button, a tiny shiver. Not of doubt, but a finality running down my spine. I pressed cancel. A small check mark appeared. The first thread was cut. Next was the family phone plan. For 10 years, I had paid for his line without a second thought. It was just what a mother did. I navigated to the Provers' website. The taste of stale, bitter coffee sharp on my tongue. I found his number, a number I knew by heart, and removed it from my account. Cancel. Another thread gone. The car insurance. For the sedan he drove, the one I had co-signed the loan for because his Credit wasn't good enough at the time. I was listed as the primary policy holder. A few more taps on the cold screen. Cancel. With each press, I felt another piece of the mother I used to be fall away, replaced by this cold, methodical stranger. Was this who Arthur would have wanted me to be? I looked at the ledger at the silent testament to his foresight, and I knew the answer. He hadn't wanted this, but he had prepared for it. He had left me not just leverage, but permission to be strong. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. I knew I had until the banks opened, until the world woke up, to finish what I had to do. The digital cuts were easy, impersonal. The next step required something more. I needed the original loan documents for the car, and I knew Arthur kept all important papers in the old metal filing cabinet in his study. I moved through the dark house, my bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. In his study, the air was still thick with his scent, a mix of old paper and pipe tobacco. I pulled open the heavy drawer, the metal groaning in the silence. My fingers searched through folders labeled insurance, taxes, mortgage, and then they brushed against a thick, unfamiliar document tucked away in the back of the utilities folder where it didn't belong. It was folded into a stiff rectangle. Curious, I pulled it out. It wasn't a bill or a statement. It was a deed. The paper was thick, official, with a raised seal at the bottom. My eyes scanned the legal description. The address of a small parcel of land on the north side of town. A piece of land I had completely forgotten Arthur buying as an investment over a decade ago. A piece of land Michael had recently told me he and Sarah had just secured for their new dream home. And there at the bottom of the document, under the line for owner, was not his name. It was mine. Clara Ann Miller. In that moment, holding the crisp, undeniable proof of ownership, I realized my plan had just changed. Canceling his cards and his phone was just the beginning. By 8:30 the next morning, my son wasn't just going to be locked out of my bank account. He was going to be locked out of his future. Secrets, I've learned, are like seeds. You can bury them deep in the dark, but they never truly sleep. Some sprout into weeds of regret, others into poisonous vines. But the secret I held in my hands, as the first gray light of dawn bled through my kitchen window, was different. It was Arthur's secret, a seed of strength he had planted decades ago. And all through the long, silent night, I had been watering it with a cold, clear purpose. Now, as the sun began its slow climb, it was time for that secret to break the surface. The night of cancel was over. The morning of consequences was about to begin. I sat at my kitchen table, the deed to the land spread out before me like a declaration of war. I watched the watery sunlight catch the raised official seal, making it glint like a single cold eye. On the stove, the digital clock blinked impassively. 6:59 a.m. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind of stillness that comes after a violent storm. I was no longer a grieving widow or a heartbroken mother. I was a strategist. I was the inheritor of Arthur's final. Brilliant plan. At precisely 8 goals, I made my first call. The number was on a crisp old-fashioned business card tucked inside the ledger. Gable and Sons, attorneys at law. A gruff, no-nonsense voice answered on the second ring. Gable. Mr. Gable, I said, my voice steady. This is Clara Miller, Arthur Miller's wife. There was a pause, then a sound of recognition. Clara, it's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about Arthur. He was a good man, I said, the words feeling simple and true. He was also a thorough man. I believe he left a file with you under the name Contingency. The silence on the other end was telling. Yes, Gable said slowly. I have it right here. Good, I said. I'm activating it. I gave him the parcel number from the deed. My instructions were clear and concise. First, his firm was to immediately post official no trespassing signs around the entire perimeter of the property. Second, he was to file an immediate injunction with the county planning office to halt any and all permit applications or development plans associated with that land. Citing a dispute in ownership, my ownership. Gable didn't ask questions. He simply said, consider it done, Clara. It'll all be filed by 8:30. As I hung up, I pictured the shockwaves my actions would create. I saw Michael, smug and confident, swiping his credit card to buy gas and seeing the word declined in stark red letters. I saw Sarah at her favorite expensive coffee shop having her payment rejected, the small humiliation stinging her pride. And then the main event, the call from their contractor, his voice confused, telling them that the bulldozers had been turned away at the gate, that the land they thought was theirs was now legally off limits. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Do you agree, or does it just leave everyone frozen in the end? I didn't feel warmth or satisfaction, only a chilling, resolute sense of justice. This was not about emotion anymore. This was about correcting an imbalance. The clock on the stove turned. Oh. The banks were open. The lawyers were at work. The world was now operating on my new terms. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam warming my hands. And I waited. I expected the phone to ring any second. I braced myself for the explosion of rage from Michael, the high-pitched fury from Sarah. The phone did ring, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet house. I picked it up, my heart steady. Hello. But the voice on the other end was not Michael's. It was my sister Martha, and she was crying. Clara. Oh, thank God. Michael just called me. He was absolutely hysterical. Her voice was thick with a pity that was clearly not meant for me. He said, you've gone mad with grief. That you're trying to destroy his life just to punish him. Clara, what have you done to your own son? He confessed everything to me, Clara. The confession my sister Martha spoke of was not my son's. It was a masterful, shocking fiction he had spun just for her, and she had swallowed it whole. Her voice on the other end of the line was a symphony of misplaced pity. Each sob and hiccup a perfectly tuned instrument in his manipulative orchestra. He said he and Sarah are so worried about you. She wept, the sound crackling with static and sympathy. That ever since Arthur passed, you've been well, not yourself. He said you've been hiding money, getting paranoid about the bills. He told me they only asked to help you manage your finances, to put your name on their new house so you'd have a secure asset, and you just snapped. The sound of my own name being used in this twisted narrative felt bizarre, as if she were talking about a stranger, a pathetic mad old woman from a storybook. I stayed perfectly silent, listening to the architecture of the lie, marveling at its cruel genius. He hadn't painted me as a monster. He had painted me as a victim of my own broken mind. It was a far more effective prison. The grief I felt in that moment was not for my son. I had already mourned the boy he used to be. This was a new sharper grief for my sister, for the 70 years of shared history of scraped knees, whispered secrets, and hands held at funerals that he had erased with a single 30-minute phone call. Is it worse to be betrayed by your child or by a sibling who should have known better? My son's betrayal was a sudden violent amputation. My sister's was a slow-acting poison seeping into the roots of my past and killing everything from the inside out. He was sobbing. Clara, Martha continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the sound of it making my skin crawl. He didn't want to tell me, but he's afraid you're going to end up with nothing alone in that big house. He said. Cutting him off was a cry for help. I finally made a sound, the gentle clink of my porcelain teacup settling into its saucer. The small sharp noise seemed to startle her. Martha, I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the hysterics she was expecting. Let me ask you a question. When he was telling you all this, was he crying? Of course he was, she said, her voice rising defensively. He was utterly heartbroken. That's interesting, I said, the words as cold and smooth as river stones. He didn't shed a single tear when he stood in my bedroom and called me a bank. The line went silent. I had not defended myself, not explained, not pleaded. I had simply handed her a single sharp piece of the truth and let its edge do the work. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. The smooth narrative Michael had built hitting its first tiny snag. But I knew it wasn't enough to stop his momentum. He was poisoning the well, ensuring that when I came to my family for a drink of support, all I would find was his venom. I have to go, Martha, I said, cutting her off before she could recover. You believe whatever story makes you feel better. I ended the call and placed the phone gently back in its cradle. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. It was the silence of total isolation. He had not only cut me out of his family, he was now systematically cutting me out of my own. I stood up and walked to the living room window, looking out at the quiet, empty street. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a tremor of genuine fear. I had a plan. I had leverage. But what good was it if I had no one left in the world to stand with me? As that chilling thought took hold, a sound broke the stillness. A firm, polite knock on my front door. It wasn't Michael's impatient banging or Sarah's demanding rap. It was a solid, measured sound. My heart leaped into my throat. Slowly, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. My breath caught. Standing on my porch was a man I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. It was George Evans, Arthur's oldest friend. His contracting business was one of the first names I had seen in the ledger. His face was weathered, his eyes kind, and in his hand he was holding a worn, familiar-looking, leather-bound book. The man on my porch was a ghost from a life I thought was buried, but his first words were a chilling bulletin from the present. Clara, I came as soon as I heard. George Evans's voice was just as I remembered it, deep, steady, and honest. Your son called me not 30 minutes ago. He held my gaze, his own, filled with a mixture of sorrow and steel. The things he said about you, about Arthur, it was the most shameful betrayal of a good man's memory I have ever heard. He had seen the betrayal for what it was. He had not been fooled. In that instant, the crushing weight of my isolation lifted, replaced by a fragile, fluttering hope. I opened the door wider, my hand trembling slightly on the cold brass knob. George, I whispered. Come in. He stepped inside, bringing with him the crisp morning air and a sense of solidity that seemed to push back against the shadows in my house. He offered his hand, and when I took it, his grip was firm and calloused. A working man's hand. It felt like an anchor. It felt real. In the kitchen, I poured us both coffee, my hands moving with a purpose they hadn't had before his arrival. I watched him wrap his rough fingers around the warm ceramic mug, a small tangible comfort. He took a slow sip before speaking again. He tried to feed me the same story, I imagine, George said, his eyes fixed on the ledger I had left on the table. That you were unwell, that you were losing your grip, that he and his wife were worried you'd be left with nothing. He shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. The boy has his father's name, but he doesn't have an ounce of his character. Michael made one fatal mistake, Clara. He assumed the men your husband helped were as greedy and stupid as he is. The quiet dread I'd felt at Martha's call returned. But it was different now. It was the dread of a general realizing the enemy has opened a new front, but who now has an ally to help her fight. Do you think the family you choose can sometimes be stronger than the family you're born into? As I looked at George, a man bound to us by nothing more than loyalty and a handshake from 20 years ago, I knew the answer. He helped a lot of people, I said quietly, gesturing to my ledger. I'm only just realizing how many. George smiled, a sad knowing smile. He reached into the canvas bag he'd brought with him and pulled out a second book. It was nearly identical to mine, leather-bound, thick, and heavy with age. He placed it on the table beside Arthur's. The touch of its worn cover against the polished wood felt solid, final. Arthur and I were partners in this, he explained. He called us the leverage ledger. It was for the people he had to protect himself from, like Sarah's father. But this one, he tapped the cover of the new book. We called this the legacy ledger. It doesn't track debts, Clara. It tracks promises. It's a record of the good men Arthur invested in, the community he built in secret. He opened the book, and I saw pages filled with the same neat script. But the columns were different. They were headed investment, promise, outcome. Every man in this book, George said, his voice thick with emotion, owes his success to your husband. Michael didn't just call me this morning. He called half a dozen of us. He thought he was isolating you. Instead, he just reminded a lot of powerful men exactly who they owe their loyalty to. A shiver ran through me, a powerful current of understanding. This was the army Arthur had left me. But George wasn't finished. He flipped towards the back of his ledger, his expression turning grave. There's one more entry you need to see. It was the last promise Arthur ever asked me to witness. He turned the book to face me, his finger pointing to the bottom of a page. The entry was dated just 6 months before Arthur died. My eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, but the words were utterly alien. It described the establishment of a trust, a substantial one set up in Michael's name, but it was the final line, a handwritten condition in stark black ink that made the air freeze in my lungs. In the event, I read aloud, my voice a choked whisper, that Michael Thomas Miller ever places his own financial gain above the well-being of his mother, the full contents of this trust are to be immediately and irrevocably redirected. My finger traced the final words of the clause. My mind struggling to comprehend the beautiful, brutal brilliance of my husband's final move. I remember one Thanksgiving years ago when Arthur was still alive. Michael had brought Sarah home for the first time and the house was filled with the scent of roasted turkey and the sound of laughter. I can still see the sight of them all so clearly, their faces glowing in the candle light, a perfect portrait of family. Arthur carved the bird. Michael told a funny story from college, and Sarah smiled, looking every bit the perfect daughter-in-law. I treasured that memory, held it like a polished stone. I never imagined a day would come when the only table we would share would be a lawyer's, with legal documents stacked between us like a barricade, the air thick, not with warmth, but with the sterile, silent hum of consequence. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock in Mr. Gable's boardroom. The visual of the room itself was a statement. A long, unforgiving mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, heavy leather chairs that felt like thrones, and tall windows that looked out over the city, but let in no warmth. I had chosen my clothes with care, not the soft sweaters of a grandmother, but a sharp dark gray suit that had belonged in my professional wardrobe from a lifetime ago. When I looked at my reflection before leaving the house, the woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes clear and her mouth set in a firm, determined line. This was not the woman I was, but this was the woman I had to be. Michael and Sarah arrived a few minutes late. A deliberate power play that fell completely flat in the tomb-like silence of the room. They looked haggard. The past few days, without their usual financial cushion, had clearly taken a toll. Sarah's designer suit was slightly wrinkled, and Michael's face was pale. His eyes darting around the room with a nervous energy that betrayed his forced confidence. They saw me sitting at the head of the table with George Evans at my right hand, a silent, immovable mountain of a man. Their shared look of surprise was my first small victory. They expected a weeping old woman they could bully. They found a queen with her counsel. Mr. Gable entered all business, and the proceedings began. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid out the first document on the gleaming table. "This," he said, his voice flat, "is the certified deed to the Northwood parcel of land. As you can see, the sole unencumbered owner is Clara Miller. Any attempt to build on or access this property will be met with legal action." I watched Sarah's face, the color drained from it, leaving a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Her dream house built on my land had just vanished into thin air. Next, Gable slid a thick file across the table. "This is the file pertaining to a personal loan extended by Arthur Miller to Robert Sterling 22 years ago. The principal compounded with 2 decades of unpaid interest is now due to Mr. Miller's estate. We will be contacting Mr. Sterling's attorneys to arrange a payment schedule. The amount is substantial." Michael's head snapped towards Sarah, his expression a mask of dawning horrified betrayal. He had been a pawn in her family's long con, but the final act was yet to come. When you have to destroy a part of your own life to save yourself, is it a victory or just a different kind of loss? I felt a flicker of that mother from the Thanksgiving table, a pang of sorrow for the boy who had once laughed so freely. But the boy was gone. Only the man who had called me a bank remained. Gable opened one last slender folder. "Finally," he said, "the matter of the Michael Thomas Miller Trust, established by his father." For the first time, a flicker of hope appeared in Michael's eyes. It was almost pitiful. Gable cleared his throat and read the betrayal clause aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room. He then placed several signed affidavits on the table from George and 2 other men from the legacy ledger. These sworn statements detailing Mr. Miller's attempts to defame his mother and seize control of her assets have officially triggered this clause. As of 9:01 a.m. this morning, the trust was dissolved. Its contents have been redirected per Mr. Miller's final instructions to the children's hospital his father always supported. It was over. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a small, strangled gasp from Sarah. Michael stared at me, his face utterly shattered, all the arrogance and anger gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate confusion. "Mom," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "Why?" I rose from my chair, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked down at my son for the last time, not at the stranger in the suit, but at the 4-year-old boy with the piggy bank, and I felt a final heartbreaking pang of loss for what could have been. Then I looked at the man he had become. "Because a bank, Michael," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the vast silent room, "must always protect its assets." I turned without a backward glance, and walked out of the room, leaving them to drown in the consequences Arthur and I had built for them. The betrayal, when it came for the final time, wasn't a shout in my kitchen or a cold command in my bedroom. It was a pathetic, broken whisper captured and contained in the digital world of my voicemail. I was in my garden, my hands buried in the rich, dark earth, the late afternoon sun, warm on my back. I had let the call go unanswered. Now standing in my quiet kitchen, I pressed play and the sound of my son's voice, a sound I hadn't heard in 3 months, filled the room. Mom, please pick up. I'm sorry." His voice was wrecked, thin and greedy, stripped of all its former arrogance. "I'll do anything. Sarah's left me. Her father is suing me, trying to blame me for everything. I have nothing. I'm living in a tiny apartment. Mom, please. Don't you owe me just one more chance?" I listened to the word OUAE hanging in the air, the last toxic seed from a plant I had already ripped out by the roots. Even in his ruin, his first instinct was to speak of what was due to him. The betrayal wasn't in his desperation. It was in his utter inability to understand the world in any other terms. I stood there for a long moment, feeling nothing. No anger, no pity, not even the ghost of maternal love. The space inside me he had once occupied was now a calm, quiet garden, just like the one outside my window. With a steady finger, I pressed a single button on the machine. The sound of the message being erased, a short electronic bleep, was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the story finally being over. My life since that day in the lawyer's office had been quiet, but it had not been lonely. The silence left by Michael and Sarah was quickly filled with new sounds, or rather old sounds I was only just beginning to appreciate. The sound of George's booming laugh in my living room as he told me stories about Arthur I'd never heard. The sound of a hammer on a Saturday morning as another man from the Legacy Ledger, a carpenter named Bill, fixed the sagging step on my front porch, refusing any payment other than a cup of coffee. The sound of chatter and clinking glasses, as the families Arthur had quietly built, came together in my home, not for a tense holiday meal, but for a simple, joyful barbecue. They had become my family. A family built not on the fragile ties of blood, but on the bedrock of loyalty. I learned through George what had become of my son. Stripped of his expected inheritance and the promise of Sarah's family wealth, the world had revealed itself to him in all its harsh reality. Sarah, whose love was clearly a commodity, had left him the moment he became a bad investment. Her father, desperate to save his own crumbling reputation, had publicly and legally cast Michael as a manipulative villain to save himself. Michael had tried to build a life on a foundation of lies and entitlement, and without my money to prop it up, the entire structure had collapsed. I mourned the boy. He was the laughing child at the Thanksgiving table. But I could not find it in me to mourn the man. I had to lose a son to finally find myself. And the woman I found was stronger than I ever knew. Arthur hadn't just left me weapons. He had left me a blueprint for a better life. A reminder that true wealth is the community you build and the respect you earn. He had been preparing me all along. Not for a war, but for the peace that comes after. The ultimate lesson I learned is that a family is not something you are born into by right. It is a garden you must tend to with love, respect, and loyalty. If you only ever come to take from it, one day you will find that you have poisoned your own roots and there is nothing left to sustain you. What did you think of my final decision? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.